People's Scrutiny Commission and will be chairing the meeting this evening. And I'm joined by my colleague, Councillor Adejare, who is the Vice Chair for this evening's meeting. So again, hello and welcome to everybody, whether that's those who are joining us on the live stream or those who are here with us present today. I would particularly like to thank our external guests from the Metropolitan Police, the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, Safeguarding Children Partnership, and of course the Children's Commissioner for England. We are also pleased to have present this evening a number of representatives from Hackney Youth Parliament. Just as a reminder, this is a special joint scrutiny meeting with members of both Living in Hackney and Children and Young People Scrutiny Commissions in attendance. This is a formal meeting of Hackney Council, and it is the right of the press and members of the public to attend and record the meeting. I would like to remind everyone here in the chamber or connecting online this evening that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed. If you'd like to speak, raise your hand to get my attention, and please ensure that your microphone is switched on before you speak. So I'd like to say a few words before we begin. So again, thanks to everybody who's here today for joining us for this very important meeting. In June 2022, the Living in Hackney and Children and Young People Scrutiny Commissions convened a joint meeting to review the strategic response of statutory partners to the recommendations of the Child Queue Safeguarding Practice Review, which was published in March 2022 by the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership. In this meeting, the Commissions listened to the statutory partners' responses to the review and subsequently made 9 recommendations for how they might work together to ensure that progress is made against each of the recommendations and any additional commitments made in relation to Child Queue. The aim of tonight's joint meeting is to help maintain oversight of this progress and the wider outcomes of this case. Child Queue's case highlighted systemic failings across child protection and safeguarding systems, with the Safeguarding Practice Review concluding, and I paraphrase, that Child Queue should not have been strip searched that day, that there was an absence of a safeguarding first approach by all professionals involved, and that the intervention was disproportionate and ultimately harmful to Child Queue. The review goes on to say, and I quote, that racism, whether deliberate or not, was likely to have been an influencing factor in the decision to undertake a strip search, and references adultification bias as having significance to the experience of Child Queue that day. Child Queue's case, when published, evoked widespread shock, outrage, and condemnation, but members of our community told us that they were shocked but not surprised. Many of these people stood outside Stoke Newington Police Station and on the steps of this very building in March last year and reminded us that the writing had been on the wall, and how Child Queue's case was a symptom of the unchecked systemic racism evident in the over-policing and over-sanctioning of Black and global majority children by the police and in our schools. It is worth noting that Saturday the 22nd of April marked the 30th anniversary of the brutal and racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. Since then, we've had the Macpherson report, the Lammy review, and only this year the Casey report. Each report serves as yet another damning indictment of the institutional racism, disproportionality, and the distinct lack of progress since the publication of the report before it. Now, three decades on from the murder of Stephen Lawrence, here we are, wearily rehearsing the same tired lines because the response to each of those reports has been woefully inadequate in bringing about change. Only on Saturday, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said that the Met Police remains institutionally racist. It's like Groundhog Day. This lack of progress is not the legacy befitting of the unrelenting struggles endured by the Lawrence family in highlighting the scourge of racism and discriminatory practices in the Met, and we cannot allow a lack of progress to be the legacy of Child Queue's case. Child Queue expressed, and I quote, that all the people that allowed this to happen need to be held responsible, and that things need to change with all organisations involved. Today, we're here to hear from the statutory partners who have been tasked with actioning the recommendations from the Safeguarding Practice Review and ensuring that the systemic change that Child Queue called for is realised. The aim of this joint scrutiny meeting is to help maintain oversight of statutory agencies' progress against the recommendations from the Child Queue Safeguarding Practice Review and wider outcomes of this case, In particular, members of this Joint Scrutiny Commission are keen to ensure that there is tangible and sustained progress and learning from the Child Q Safeguarding Practice Review recommendations, that public accountability is maintained, and that there continues to be effective governance and oversight of the required improvements, and that there is full and effective cooperation across the local partnership in addressing key issues arising from the Child Q case. Public scrutiny and democratic accountability forms an integral part of this process and must be underpinned by a reflective culture where local residents are at the heart of decision making. By keeping Child Q on our agenda, which we intend to, and making the much broader themes of anti-racism and ensuring that safeguarding first approaches are promoted and embedded in practice, we are ensuring that these themes remain central to the broader work of our respective commissions. Thank you for your patience. We will now begin the meeting. In the interest of time, we will forego introductions from everyone present, but can I ask that when you speak, you can introduce yourself first? And can I also ask that people refrain from using acronyms today? There are many people here present and presumably also viewing on the live stream who won't know what they stand for. So if you could, that would be much appreciated. So now moving on to item 2, which is apologies for absence. I have apologies for Councillor Joseph, Commander Carl Gordon from the Met, Mark Carroll, the Chief Executive, and Jackie Burke, the Group Director. Do I have any other apologies for absence? No, okay. Moving on to item 3, urgent items, order of business. Members of the Commission and officers attending will have been notified that there has been an addition to the meeting and that the Children's Commissioner has kindly agreed to attend to present her findings from a national analysis of police strip searches of children. The Children's Commissioner report is being considered as an urgent item and will be taken after item 6 on the agenda. The adjusted running of order and timings has been circulated to all members and contributors and has been published ahead of this meeting. Item 4, declarations of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest? Joe.
Joe McLeod, Hackney School Governor.
Still Governor as well, sorry, Parkwood.
Councillor Sadiq.
Also member local school board at Waterside Academy.
Councillor Ross.
School Governor at Hackney New Primary School.
Thank you very much. Now moving on to item 5, the minutes of the last meeting. So members will recall after the publication of Child Q Safeguarding Practice Review, a first joint scrutiny session of these commissions was held on the 13th of June. The aim of this first meeting was to ensure that the response of local agencies to the Child Q Safeguarding Practice Review was both strategic and coordinated, and that there were effective accountability structures in place to review and monitor progress against agreed improvements. The minutes of that meeting are contained at page 11 to 28 of the report pack. Can I ask members to note the minutes and if they wish to raise any matters from the minutes? Do members agree the minutes of the meeting? Great, thank you. Now moving on to item 6, the update on Child Q reports. So this is a brief item to update members of the Commission on the status of a number of expected reports associated with the case of Child Q. So in respect of the IOPC report, so that's the Independent Office for Police Conduct, who investigated the conduct of 3 local police officers in connection with the Child Q case in May 2021. Is that right? 21? The most recent public update about this investigation was given on March the 16th, 2022, which noted that all lines of investigation had been completed and the report was being finalised. The Scrutiny Commissions here in Hackney received a formal update from the IOPC yesterday, the 24th of April, 2023, which unfortunately was too late to include in the agenda pack, but is being formally tabled today, and copies of the response have been distributed in the chamber and will also be published on the website. The key excerpts from this update are that our investigation report is in its final stages and we expect it will be completed in the near future. Once it is completed, we will decide whether we think any officers should face disciplinary action and provide this along with our report to the Metropolitan Police Service. We are not able to give you a timetable for publication for any report or summary at this stage. However, we have committed to meet with key stakeholders at the earliest stage possible prior to issuing our findings. I wanted to ask members of the Commission if we agree on what our next steps should be in regards to this. I think it's quite clear from Child Q's own words, detailed in the practice report, that she is quite keen for those who were responsible that day to be held to account. And I think that it's clear for everybody to see that the outcome of this report is a key component of that. It's very disappointing that we're unable to review it here today, and I think it would make sense for us as a commission or joint commission to write to the IOPC and to express our disappointment, is putting it mildly, at the fact that it's not ready, and also the implications also for Child Q and her family in having to wait this length of time for an outcome. So are we in agreement that that should be our next steps? And it's worth noting that we'll also come together again as a commission once we do have that report. Okay, moving on to the Child Q Safeguarding Practice Review update. So City and Hackney Safeguarding Partnership completed its Safeguarding Practice Review into the circumstances of the strip search of Child Q in March 2022 and agreed to follow up on this review. We have Jim Gamble, the Independent Child Safeguarding Commissioner for City and Hackney, here this evening. So I will ask him to very briefly update members on the status of this report. Really sorry, Jim, but we're going to give you no more than 2 minutes. We're going to be really strict with time this evening. We've got a lot of contributors and loads of people who want to ask questions. So over to you, Jim.
There you go. I was clicking the green one. So I've already used 5 seconds of my 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair. From my point of view, I'm equally frustrated that we haven't got sight of the IOPC report. Whenever we completed the first review and report, we shared it with the IOPC and met with them so that we could establish a position. To be fair to them, I just want to say this, that they are dealing with a conduct review. And so their approach is limited on the basis of evidence and fairness. We were dealing with a learning review. And we were able to move much more swiftly once we'd been able to address the issue of the blockage that police professional standards created. I think that was part of due process rather than deliberate delay. Where we are at the minute is we're coming into the final stage of our review. We have engaged with and collected evidence from many, many young children at a street level, listen to the authentic voice of young people and young Black people in particular across Hackney. We've listened to what they've got to say about engagement with policing. We've listened to what they've got to say about the context of their lived experience. And we've listened to what they've told us about their experience within the education sector, within school. And all of that will be reflected in a report that we will be launching into the fact-checking phase within the next week or so, and then beyond that, it will be available for publication. The themes coming out of it, we reflect.
Jim, we've got about 30 seconds left, so if you could be brief.
Yeah, so the themes coming out of that are about leadership. They take stock of who has done what and who said they would do what, and they also look at issues around policing, around accountability, and around education. And I can deal later on in the session with questions directly related to that.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much, Jim. Now, moving on to item 3, which is the Children's Commissioner. The Scrutiny Commission is pleased to welcome the Children's Commissioner for England here this evening, Dame Rachel de Souza, together with officers from the Children's Commissioner's office. So we've got Samuel Howell and Cynthia Utha Akuma. Following the case of Child Q, the Children's Commissioner analysed all strip searches of children that were undertaken in England and Wales over a 4-year period to 2022. The Children's Commissioner has now published its findings and recommendations in a report, and this is a very welcome and timely contribution to the evidence of the need for change in this area. We have approximately 30 minutes for this item, so I would like to invite the Children's Commissioner to highlight key findings from her report for about 15 minutes, and then we can have the remaining 15 minutes for questions and answers from the Commission.
I'm pleased to be here with you here today to talk about this very important issue following my research last month into the use of strip searches of children by the police. Now, we're all here because of the bravery of one girl, one child who told her story, child Q. When I heard it, I made it my mission to investigate the use of strip searching, at first among the Metropolitan Police and then nationally. I had hoped to find that her story was terrible but unique, but it's not. It's thanks to her alone that scrutiny on this issue is increasing, not because of a whistleblower or an inspection report or any kind of accountability measure, but because she spoke out. Before I discuss the detail of my research into strip searching, let me speak quickly first about the central importance of children's voices and views. My role as Children's Commissioner for England is to listen to children, which is something I take incredibly seriously. When I came into post, I conducted the Big Ask survey in my first year in post, largest ever survey of children in England, over 500,000 responses from children of all backgrounds. One of the things we asked about were the barriers that were holding children back. It saddens me to say that many children saw racism and discrimination as one of these barriers. What's more positive is that children spoke passionately and compassionately about this subject. This is a generation determined to make a difference and build a fairer society. Some children talked about their experience of racism in relation to policing. As one 15-year-old told me when asked about the barriers holding children back, racism and discrimination, because it makes me feel like an outsider, and police brutality, especially towards Black people. That was a girl aged 15 who identified from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. But children also spoke about racism in education. While the vast majority of children responding were very positive about school, a worrying minority expressed concerns about how they would be treated at school by their peers or by teachers. A 15-year-old boy told me, racism in school, not just students, racist teachers, unfairness. They don't care about the students, there's no discipline. Some teachers look at different races not nicely. That's a boy aged 15. While this is far from every young person's experience of education, it is deeply concerning to me as someone who was a teacher, a head teacher, and a trust leader, that it is such a deeply felt worry for so many children. Overall, my Big Ask survey tells us the vast majority of children in England are happy with their lives. It does, however, identify children's concerns about race and discrimination in school and wider society. For many children, particularly those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, the experience of discrimination is very real. Now, I'd like to turn to the substantive issue of strip searching. As I said at the start, Child Q's experiences shocked me, as did the culture that allowed it to happen. The bravery of that 15-year-old girl in speaking up, as well as the hard work here in Hackney to review the case, is why we're able to have this conversation about how we can ensure that something like this does not happen again. I conducted my first project on the issue of strip searches because I felt I owed it to Child Q to establish whether she was the only child who this had happened to. As part of that research, I used my statutory powers to collect information on all strip searches or searches exposing intimate parts, as they're sometimes known, conducted under stop and search powers by the Metropolitan Police back to 2018. This was the type of search Child Q experienced, and unlike similar searches that occur in custody, as you know, stop and search strip searches can happen in various locations, and there is no national data on their use. I published that report in August of last year. My findings were deeply concerning and showed there were systemic problems with transparency, scrutiny, and compliance with the guidelines in how strip searches were being conducted during stop and searches at the Metropolitan Police. Between 2018 and 2020, at least 650 children were strip searched by the Metropolitan Police. These searches had a very concerning ethnic disproportionality, with 58% of boys searched being black. Over 95% of searches were of boys. A quarter of the searches were conducted on children between the ages of 10 and 15 years old. I was concerned these searches appeared to be regularly conducted in 23% of cases without the presence of an appropriate adult, as is required by the statutory codes of practice, except in the most exceptional circumstances. I was also worried by the fact that the Met Police, despite cooperating fully with my request, could not readily account for the number or circumstances of strip searches of children because of data quality issues. I considered that all of this did not indicate a system with robust safeguards or strong scrutiny. I've met with a number of ministers. I've met with the new Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, who I'm pleased to tell you has committed the force to a number of policy changes in how strip searches are conducted in London. Now, I believed after my research with the Met that there was evidence of systemic problems with these types of searches, which is why I expanded my research to all police forces in England and Wales. I published that research last month, and I can show that this is not a problem limited to London. Across 39 police forces in England and Wales, that's most of them, I found at least 2,847 children had been strip searched under stop and search powers between 2018 and mid-22. Overall, I was really concerned about quality of data and record keeping, which makes proper transparency and scrutiny difficult. There was large regional variation in the numbers of searches. Of relevance to this audience, the Metropolitan Police had the highest number of searches overall, and strip search children at the third highest rate when compared against the population of police force areas. These searches have had a pronounced and deeply worrying ethnic disproportionality, with 38% of boys searched being identified as black. Black children in England and Wales were up to 6 times more likely to be strip searched when compared to national population figures, while white children were around half as likely to be searched. Our research also found that widespread non-compliance with statutory codes of practice, including that more than half of strip searches were conducted without an appropriate adult present. While the location of strip searches was not recorded, in 45% of cases, we found potentially inappropriate locations, including takeaway outlets, private businesses, amusement parks, and a small number of searches conducted in police vehicles, and I'm sad to say, schools. In addition, 1% of strip searches were conducted within public view, and 6% were conducted with at least one officer of a different gender than the child being searched present. For me, this all comes down to safeguarding. I've talked to senior police officers who have explained to me why it's sometimes necessary to strip search children for their own safety. Look, I accept in certain very, very limited situations that may be necessary. But my challenge in return is that if this intrusive and potentially traumatic power is necessary, there must be safeguards. I find it unacceptable that police in England and Wales are largely unable to account for the necessity and circumstance of every strip search of a child that is conducted. I will not accept that this is a responsibly used power until that is the case. And mark my words, I will be checking this data every year from now on so that we can see this, unless the Home Office starts publishing it. I believe further work is needed to strengthen the guidelines around strip searches, for there to be oversight and inspection to ensure compliance and reform of a culture that's allowed this to go unchallenged. And I've made recommendations in the following 4 areas: strengthen national guidelines for strip searching, improve data to drive transparency and accountability, improve practice and compliance in all force areas, broader change in police interaction with children, and the adoption of safeguarding first policing approach. The case of Child Q means that lessons must be learned across the police and throughout the youth justice and care systems, because despite some local changes, the same national rules are in place as before the Child Q case. All of this leads to where I believe that policing needs to get to in relation to children. I'm going to continue to work with police forces this year on how the principles of safeguarding can be embedded into all interactions between police and children. For me, it's 5 principles. I'll just briefly headline them. 1, put children's needs first. 2, listen to children and respect them. 3, treat children as children, not adults, not criminals. 4, don't discriminate against certain groups of children. We know that certain groups of children are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, particularly Black children. Being discriminated against or witnessing discrimination against their family is extremely upsetting, rightly extremely upsetting, and is likely to reduce trust. Children in care are also significantly overrepresented in the custody population and have traumatic associations with the police from when they were taken into care. So that group is of great concern to me as well. And let children be themselves. It's my 5th one. Children should be allowed to make use of their neighbourhoods and public spaces freely and confidently. Too often they're demonised and judged as being troublemakers for spending time together in public. My final comments then. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all today. I want to express my gratitude to Child Q again, to her family for their bravery in setting this essential work in train. We simply cannot tolerate any more cases of this nature. Children must be treated as such. Their welfare must be our primary concern. These are not easy subjects to discuss, nor easy solutions to resolve. But I'm concerned that it took me, an ex-head teacher, the children's commissioner, not a police officer, to start shining a light. I welcome the work Hackney is doing to ask the hard questions about how Child Q was failed. I want to see this discussed widely and openly across the country, because this is not a London issue or even an isolated incident. I understand we're now opening the floor to discussion, so I'd welcome any questions or thoughts you have on how we can genuinely move forward towards a system that treats every child as a child first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contributions this evening and also for joining us. And also, indeed, for the reports. I mean, as I mentioned earlier on in my opening words, there have been a number of reports that have outlined disproportionality. And for many of us in this room today, we've been very aware of these issues. And it's really helpful when we've got data to back up what people have been saying time and time again. It just adds that extra bit of leverage, I hope, for trying to reach that change that we so desperately need to find. So thank you for your work, and of course for the special practice safeguarding practice review, which brought this particular case and these issues that we're talking about this evening to light last year. I'm now going to move to the Commission for questions. I'm going to take just one question at a time. If we can all try to be very brief, one question and brief answers if possible, so that we can get through as many as we would like to. We've initially got a question from Councillor Gordon, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for coming this evening, and thank you for your report. My question is that you make a number of recommendations in your report, some of which concern changes in guidance and potentially in legislation. What has your response been from the government, and what are you looking for from the Home Office and other parts of government?
So thanks for that. I've met with 3 successive policing ministers. There's been quite a lot of change since the launch of my last report in August, and I've been assured that the Home Office is taking the issue very seriously. My most recent report was given to the Home Office and Department for Education ministers in advance of publication. I've not yet received an official response. The report was debated in Parliament in an quite unusual urgent question, during which the Safeguarding Minister, Sarah Dines MP, accepted that the Home Office was considering the key recommendations we've made. I hope they do. I hope they accept them. They're very sensible, and they're, and we are hopeful that they will accept them. The Education Secretary has confirmed in a written parliamentary question that the Home Office is considering my recommendations. I will be seeking further with ministers on the issue, and I was pleased to see that the College of Policing have updated their strip search guidance in line with one of my recommendations already, but we need all of about data. Can you find the one we've got a detailed response, but the first thing about data is actually I had to use my S2 powers to get it. So the first thing about data is about it needs to be collected and published and done properly. So I think and the other thing that I found very troubling about the data that I got was that it was inconsistently collected across forces. There were, 45% or such hadn't even filled in the bits about whether whether an appropriate adult was present. We need to know, the data needs to be consistent right across all forces. It needs to be clear, that statutory guidance has been carried out. So who is present? Where is the appropriate adult who's meant to be present? Where is the strip search carried out? And what's been done about safeguarding? I was so concerned by the quality of data that I received. I've had to make 28 safeguarding referrals just from what I've seen, the different forces. So I think in the first place, let's just get the basics in place. So public, transparent data reporting to the Home Office that shows that statutory guidance has been followed, who's there, where is it happening, what's happening about safeguarding. That would be a good start. There are many, I've got lots of recommendations in my report, but let's start there. And basically until it is that this data is collected and collected properly, I will continue to collect it.
Thank you very much for that. And I have a question now. I wanted to ask if you could outline what progress looks like in the following key areas identified in your analysis. So how local police services ensure safeguarding is a top priority when undertaking searches, how local police services make improvements to transparency and scrutiny, how local police services increase safeguarding training provision, and how the role of local safeguarding partnerships can be built upon at a local level. And just to add on to that also, what that looks like in relation to disproportionality that you outlined in your report.
Thank you. Right, there's a lot there. So I will continue to engage with policymakers at a national level and policing stakeholders to see progress against the recommendations I've made. So in order, the culture are key in police services. That's going to depend on each police force, which is why I've recommended the MPCC lead on a child-first approach to policing. Secondly, I've made specific recommendations about data and scrutiny for strip searches. We were just mentioning some of them, but I think a culture that can challenge is also important. Thirdly, police should work with local partners to ensure they're getting the right expertise. For example, I was recently up talking to the West Midlands Police, who've committed to training every officer in trauma-informed practice, working with the local VRU, the local violence reduction unit. And fourthly, I've been clear, to your fourth point, I've been clear that all police forces need to take their duties as local safeguarding partners seriously. I'm glad that the new Met Commissioner has committed to senior officers attending partnerships to raise their priority. I think on disproportionality.
We'll be considering it in. We have a secondary program this year where we've committed to looking at a safeguarding first policing to children and considering wider issues around policing and children,
And disproportionality.
including disproportionality.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now moving on to some other questions from the Commission. So we've got a question from Councillor Tevitt Deloff, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I'm a mental health champion for high communities related to the impact strip search has on young people. The report highlights the humiliating and traumatic impact that strip search and more intimate searches have upon children. What has your investigation uncovered about what happens to children after they have been searched? What sort of support has been provided to help them deal with the impact of an intimate search? Thank you.
Thank you. And it's such an important question. So a very common word from the young people we interviewed about being searched was humiliation. I'm really troubled that the potentially traumatic effects of searches on children are not been properly considered. And I've recommended that the statutory guidelines should recognise the potential traumatic impact on children. My research did not focus on how police support children after a strip search. I understand it varies significantly from police force to police force, but you know, they should be thinking about safeguarding before, during and after. You know, not just, you know, it should be right the way through. This is an area I'm interested in understanding in more detail. Now, my report shows a safeguarding referral was made in 17% of cases. Unfortunately, my data doesn't include the results of those referrals. We didn't get that. In my view, if police believe a child is so involved in criminal activity, they need to strip search them. They should also be making safeguarding referrals. Regarding data, I've recommended the Home Office collect annual data on strip searches of children under stop and search. Proper scrutiny is not possible without data. This data should include the type of search, ethnicity information on the child, presence of appropriate adults, strip search, and whether a safeguarding referral was made.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Councillor Root, please.
Thank you very much. My question is about the impact of the Child Q case on children's trust and confidence in the police and other statutory services more generally. So from the work that you've carried out, what has the impact been on the trust of young people in those services? And do you think there's any action that should be taken at a national level? Or is it really about confidence building at a local level that's important? And perhaps really crucially in London, do you think that there's a need for an ongoing role for safer schools, police officers in schools?
So I totally I think it's a critical question. I believe that children's trust and confidence in police is absolutely critical. And, you know, it might sound naive, but I talk to hundreds of children in London, in a variety of settings, right around the country, and they tell me that they know the police have a very hard job. They want the police to look after them, and they want them to protect them, and they know they have to do difficult things, and they want them to have integrity. And I'm just struck by what one of the young people at that we spoke to for the report said. He didn't go to the police about being trapped in child criminal exploitation earlier because of how the police had treated him when strip searching him as a child. And I think that sort of says everything. I've spoken to Samart Rowley about this. I've been assured he takes it very seriously. I think there is so much that we could do, that the police could do, that all of us could do about rebuilding that trust. And that needs to be the urgent job coming out of this. And it doesn't have to be complex. It's about as you say, there's the Safe School Partnerships, but it's also, it's having those conversations. And I think it's really listening to children and children's experience and making sure that the children and young people of Hackney, of London, of the country feel heard, understood, and you know, get to, I think we need to get to that position where they can look up to the police with those trusting eyes that they want to, and know that they'll be protected and supported. And that's what we've got going for. So there's so many ways we could do it, but it's got to be a priority.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions that Commission members would like to ask, but we don't have as much time for answers to them as we would have hoped. So can I ask for questions and answers to be brief here, please? We've got a question from Joe.
Thank you, Chair. The Commission's note that making sure schools are inclusive and that children receive necessary support in education is going to be a priority for the Children's Commissioner in 2023-24. Will you be looking at the role of school behaviour policies and the ways in which these can potentially marginalise and exclude different groups of pupils?
Yeah, so my office is constantly keeping an eye and looking at school behaviour policies. We know, yeah, and we're often contacted about it. My business plan for this year particularly includes a project looking at outcomes and life for children in alternative provision, many of whom have been excluded. But it's an important question, and we do constantly look at it. We know that exclusion is a key issue. So.
Thank you very much. Councillor Garbett, please.
Thank you, and thank you for your report. Your analysis found that over half, so 52% of strip searches of children resulted in no further action from the police, suggesting that it's possibly unnecessary and ineffective. We also know of the negative traumatic impact of strip search. However, you do accept, and you referenced this earlier, that there are very, very specific circumstances where you think this intrusive procedure might be necessary. Just wondered if you could set those circumstances out for us and what you think they might be.
So I've asked this question of senior police officers who have told me that they feel that in order to keep children safe in life-threatening situations, they may need to use, they need to have the power to be able to strip and search for children's own safety. For me, this must be only in the most exceptional circumstances where there's serious risk to the child's life or welfare. The bar needs to be incredibly high. And again, these searches should occur in a safe, controlled, appropriate environment in accordance with strict and transparent procedures that are subject to scrutiny if they are going to happen.
And lastly, I have a question from Mia.
Hello, my name is Mia and I'm a member of Parliament. From the case of Child Q and other young people subject to being strip searched, it is clear that their voice is not always sought or represented by an appropriate adult. So, what additional safeguards would you recommend to ensure that the voice of young people is appropriately sought and considered in such procedures?
Thank you. I've committed my office to research what good child-centric policing looks like. So I hope to be able to answer this in more detail later in the year. As a general principle, I'd say listen to children and young people and respect them.
Thank you so much for answering those questions and again for joining us this evening and contributing towards this really critical item. It's most appreciated. We will now be moving on to item 7, which is the response to scrutiny findings and recommendations. At the last joint scrutiny meeting, members of the Commission made a number of preliminary findings and recommendations to local partners. A link to the findings, recommendations of the Commission can be found at page 31 of the report pack. Our recommendations were sent to the Metropolitan Police, Hackney Council, the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, and City and Hackney Safeguarding Partnership, and their joint response is provided at pages 33 to 51 of the report pack. To give all our partners an opportunity to speak and to maximise time for questions from members of the Commission, we have agreed to split this item into 2 parts. To begin with, we will invite lead representatives from City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership Hackney Council, Metropolitan Police and the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime to give a brief update on key areas of progress in relation to Child Q within their respective organisations since our last meeting in June 2022. Then, rather than go through the partnership response to each of our recommendations, we think it more productive to have a themed question and answer on those areas listed at page 31 of the report pack. So we're now moving on to the partner presentation part, which we have 20 minutes for this. We'll start with presentations. I'd like to remind our contributors to stick to their allotted time. So you have roughly 5 minutes, well, no, not roughly, 5 minutes each. I have to be strict, sorry. So to start, I would like to invite Jim Gamble to start with an update from the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Chair. First, I'd like to welcome the work of the Children's Commissioner, and we are flattered that it reflects so many of the key findings that we looked at back in March 2022. And we have been committed for some time, not least going back to Child C and others here about a safeguarding first philosophy. We've been working hard to engage with the community, to listen to the voice of young people, some of whom are here with us today. And we are reflecting on issues like safer schools officers, because safeguarding first is easy to say, it's much more difficult to deliver. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What difference does it make? We've had a lot of feedback from different partnerships, from different partner members, about the fact that safer schools officers shouldn't be in schools. We totally oppose that. The right police officer in school with the right attitude, following the right philosophy, who mentors children and young people and diverts them from the criminal justice system as opposed to pathwaying them in, is exactly what we need. We need to facilitate the humanization of the face of policing alongside young people. And that's what the young people in the many schools that I have visited in Hackney over the last year have been saying to me. There is an adversarial, we're finding across the partnership, an adversarial feeling between young people in Hackney and the police, and indeed some aspects of other partnerships, be they children's social care, be they education or elsewhere. There's a lack of trust. So we recognize we need to rebuild that. We've had excellent engagement with health. They have been from set key. It was indeed a health professional who drew the Child Q case to my attention. Had she not, had Marcia from Health not done that, goodness knows how long it would have been until this case shook the system and, brought us to where we are today. Our partners in police, we've been critical of them. Whenever this case came to bear, they weren't the most enthusiastic partners about commissioning a review. That is a fact. But we are more optimistic now. We see a different type of leadership, and there are real issues about police responsibility for delivering a police service in Hackney and local accountability. The accountability is lost because of the layering of the Metropolitan Police. So let me just say, be it health, be it police, we are moving forward and we're moving in the right direction, recognizing all of the flaws within each of the partnerships. Education has rallied. I have to say that whenever this broke, we were so keen, and rightly so, to protect the anonymity of Child Q and her family that we didn't name the school, and rightly so. But that meant that other schools were operating under the shadow of the Child Q case. And I'd like to say that we've been able to build relationships, and in engaging with senior leadership teams in our partners in schools, what we've seen is a really excellent response, taking on board the recommendation by ourselves through Department for Education around searching. Searching in school fundamentally seems to be, focused on phones, but it has a disproportionate impact on children and young people. Uniform policy. And one of the things we've found in the partnership, and I want to say this, is the partner that really fails us most often is central government. We talk about having a child-focused and child-centric approach, yet central government, if you go to their website and look at the policies that should or must be published on a school website, are all about uniform policy or behaviour in a punitive sense. But they don't have to put their safeguarding and child protection policy on. So at a local level, we're doing what we can. But at a central level in central government, I don't feel that we're being appropriately respected or supported. And I'll leave it at that.
Oh, wow, you have 1 minute to spare there, Jim, so thank you very much. appreciating that. And we do really eagerly await your report, and we can clearly see from both of the times that you've spoken this evening how much work has gone into this, and we're really quite keen to hear more about those findings and to progress some of the work that actually these commissions have been involved with that predates Child Q, because these issues are not new, and all of us in this room understand and appreciate that. So thank you. Okay, now handing over to the Metropolitan Police, James Conway, the Borough Commander.
Thanks very much, Chair. Again, I'd probably like to start by reflecting on one of your earlier comments that lack of progress can't be the legacy of these events, and that's very much the position that we take here in Hackney and Tower Hamlets from a policing perspective. Again, we welcome reports from Dame Rachel D'Souza, obviously already welcomed and been working hard on the reports that Jim's produced, and in addition, obviously at a wider level to the Dame Casey report, which we've also received recently. Again, we can see common themes emerging from more of those reports. One which is really interesting, which again we heard reflected in Dame Rachel's comments there, was the distinction between technical legality and compliance with codes of practice or statutory frameworks, and the difference between that and a proportionate, ethical and human face of policing. And one of the things we're really determined to try and deliver here in Tower Hamlets and Hackney is just the latter, and to create a model of policing that meets the needs of community and delivers that ethical approach to policing, one that's proportionate, works with communities, works with children, regardless of technical compliance with codes of practice and elsewhere. The watchword has to be that putting ethics back at the heart of our policing approach. I also want to make a little bit of a short comment around what is a wider theme with a number of these reports, and particularly a renewed commitment to anti-racism, which sits at the heart of a lot of our work that will be undertaken between police and local authority here in Hackney. I have some brilliant staff who come to work, do an incredibly difficult job, and do so in an environment which is consistently traumatizing for them in the work that they do. And I think I'm convinced the vast majority of those are avowedly anti-racist. And yet I'm running a system that is producing disproportionate outcomes and is producing racist outcomes in the way that we deliver policing here in Hackney. We fully accept Louise Casey's report, particularly a description of over-policing of communities, and also the comments made by Dame Rachel D'Souza on criminalisation, and those are very, very clear and present concerns which we have, and at the forefront of our steps to address and create that sort of that brand of policing that delivers what we need for the communities of Hackney. We also acknowledge that, of course, events like the search of Child Q, whilst in reports exist as single incidents, for the communities sit as part of a long history of events which have led to a traumatizing effect in communities. And we very, very much accept and understand now, I think, that we see a sort of a cumulative impact that almost strikes at the heart of community DNA, and we see passed down through generations in Hackney. And so what we're confronting isn't a single instance or a single event, but is that cumulative history of the relationship between police and communities. And although that doesn't necessarily change that just by acknowledging it, I think it's important that we do acknowledge it, and we place on record that that sits at the heart of our response to these challenges. Well, I think we'll probably get into some of the detail of what our responses look like to the individual reports in a moment, but it very much sits across a number of different themes. Firstly is the critical, almost the first aid operational response that we needed to put in place to ensure that events like those experienced by Child Q didn't happen again. Those are very much not the job done. These were the absolute bare minimum we needed to put in place, the emergency measures we needed to put in place to ensure that events like this didn't happen again. Those include raising the authority around certain types of searches that involve intimate parts being exposed. It ensured that automatic safeguarding referrals were made in a way we've just heard about. It ensured a clear recording of appropriate adults and key details about those type of searches are entered onto Met Police systems. It's included piloting of a multi-agency trauma response to any of these type of searches occurring on Hackney. It included updates to Met guidance in a similar way to we heard the College of Policing guidance being improved.
Sorry, James, you have about 30 seconds left.
But as I say, that's very much just the start of it. We'll probably hear in the course of this afternoon around the improvements we're making in training, the improvements we're looking to make in scrutiny, the engagement we'll be making at senior levels in listening and speaking to young people. Some of those who I've spoken to are sitting in the room today, both in the Youth Parliament, Young Futures, Rise Up East, and the recent Account Conference, and also the very strong governance we've got between policing, local authority, MOPAC, and other partners, looking at Trust and Confidence Action Plan and a Trust and Confidence Working Group with members of the community right at the heart of scrutinising and directing the police response to this. So this is not the police sitting in isolation speaking to its same old partners in its local environment and coming up with its own conclusions. We are very much taking the product of these reports and having direct conversations with young people, direct conversations with the communities in Hackney, and looking at crafting that ethical, anti-racist response which you demand rightfully from us here in Hackney.
Thank you very much for that, James. Now we will move on to Kenny Bowie from MOPAC. He's the Director of Strategy and Metropolitan Police Service Oversight.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I will try and give you back some of the time here. I'll be brief. So we would also like to very much welcome the Children Commissioner's report and say how useful we found that coming in. In terms of what's changed in particular since the last time we were here, I would simply point out from a MOPAC perspective that we have entirely new leadership within the Met. You have new leadership here in Hackney as well. And I would say that from the interactions we have had, especially when we raised this with the new Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner, and DAC Lawrence Taylor came along as well, the response certainly was very positive, and I would agree with what Jim said about the fact that they are clearly very committed to getting this right and taking it forward. We've obviously been scrutinising MPS use of stop and search for quite a while. We do that through oversight boards, through bilateral conversations I've just talked about, and again, it is on the agenda for our disproportionality board tomorrow, which follows on a year on from when we had that last conversation. It is also going to be and is in the annual use of force work, which comes to the disproportionality board or comes to a scrutiny, MOPAC scrutiny session every year. So we'll be looking at that. I would say the other thing, if you look at following our interventions and I was speaking to the Met, there is now public dashboards available, which actually makes not all of the data which the Children's Commissioner was talking about, but it's certainly, I think, a vast step forward. And I think we'll come on to what that shows in terms of the reduction in numbers and exactly why that's the case. And it probably says more about past practice than current practice, if I am honest with you. I would also say, point out that the London Ethics panel, which is a policing panel, which MOPAC set up, produced a report on this, I think, in September last year, which also made a number of recommendations. I can provide a link to that if that's useful for people. And the response from the Met was that they would be accepting all of those recommendations as well. So I'll leave it there, but just to say that we do have confidence that with the new leadership in the Met, that things will hopefully move in the right direction in this.
Thank you very much for that. I did want to make a brief comment actually on, because you've both commented on your hopes and optimism around new leadership, but I'm just mindful that after making reference to the Stephen Lawrence murder 30 years ago, that we've seen a lot of new borough commanders and police commissioners, and yet the progress has still been slow. So I'm really keen to explore these areas further with you throughout this meeting, because it's clear that this is more than just the will of new leaders. Okay, now moving on to Hackney Council, please. I think we're starting with the Mayor.
We're finishing with the Mayor, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.
What we did was, as soon as the Child Q review report was published, we stepped in to work with the police in responding to support the police to respond effectively to the report's recommendation and the wider trust and confidence work. We also stepped in to press on the Metropolitan Police Commissioner that they needed to work closely with us as a council and the community to rebuild trust and bring about meaningful change in policing in Hackney. Since then, I have ensured that there was an action plan that is relentlessly progressed. And this is a plan for the whole of the borough, though owned by the Met locally and centrally with the council as well as the community partners we are working with. Through this, we form a trust and confidence working group in Hackney. The working group and action plan keep us on track. We report to a police action board. This board is co-chaired by the borough commander and the chief executive. Ultimately, their work feed into the community safety partnership work. The action plan has priorities that covers leadership, culture and practice, anti-racism, community engagement, community monitoring, and training. And it includes specific set of 3, 6, and 12 months action plan to monitor the progress. Through this action plan, we have ensured that the police are hearing directly from our young people, increased collaboration between the police and youth organizations in the borough. The council supported the police to better engage the community. This includes rolling a program of bi-monthly community-led conversations with senior police leaders. And I've also ensured that the conversation with the borough commander to establish ways to respond to disproportionality in police data. Also setting up a restorative justice pilot scheme to enable young people to share negative experiences around stop and search with the council as well as with the police. Before I stop, Chair, just to mention that we have been working with MOPAC, the police and the community to build a more representative community scrutiny group in the borough. This Hackney will be the first borough to launch this work. I'll stop here and pass to Councillor Bramble. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to commend Child Q, her mother and her family for their strength throughout all of this. An inconceivable thing happened in one of our schools, and in a moment, one of the safest places for children became unsafe. And rightly so, the council has put time and resources into looking at not just the incident, but also the learning to ensure that our policies and practice reflect that, whether it was ensuring there was a framework in place for schools around searches within school, preempting obviously the national update we thought that was coming, that was called for in the report, working with the school itself, making sure that there were support arrangements for the leadership team, the children and the broader community, making sure that the right training was there in place and thinking about what that looks like and what that should be, providing and supporting safe spaces for talking for children and young people, whether it was around adultification, racism, but also talking to children about their rights, which is key. And making sure that governors and leaders were briefed on the report so they were fully abreast and understood the report and the outcomes and what that meant. And we're working in co-production with schools around a charter, an inclusion charter, with a conversation and actions around disproportionality, children with disabilities and special educational needs. The Mayor and I launched our 4-day anti-racist practice conference, and also we attended 2 symposiums that were held in our secondary school, because when we talk about being anti-racist, we have to understand what that means and then think about what that impact looks like and ultimately how we measure the outcomes of that. There's a series of things that we've done to ensure that we're capturing the voices of children and young people. Some of the things that we've done is training with young people and our governors around exclusions. One of the things that we've done is an initiative around Get Hackney governing. As a result of that, we now have more governors that are from Black and global majority backgrounds, but actually they are a lot younger. And it's taken at a local level those pragmatic policies, initiatives of what we can shape to ensure that the environment looks and challenges the environment for our children and young people. It's really important that we do this. Why? Our children and young people deserve this. All that we do must ensure that we build a legacy of change, because our young people deserve better, demand better, and we will advocate for better until we all see that change that is absolutely needed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to echo your powerful and opening and fully endorse it to this meeting. And as others have said, we're only here because we're anchored in the horrific experience of Child Q and what she went through. It was racist, it exemplified adultification, and it failed to safeguard her welfare. I'm not going to repeat though what I said in 2022 now. Moving on to where we are and where we're going. As an administration, we've always wanted to welcome the scrutiny role that we have in holding the police, the council itself, and our schools and education system and partners to account, to deliver tangible and sustained progress against the recommendations, not just of the original report, but also the recommendations from Scrutiny. I think from the start we've owned and supported the commissioning of that report, even though it didn't have direct recommendations for us as council. And as an administration, we've been intrinsic in leading that partnership response alongside Deputy Mayor Bramble and Councillor Jana Thomas. I'm not going to repeat what they've already outlined, but I did just want to expand upon it into our wider work on anti-racism. At a London level, Hackney has led the London Council's work around anti-racism. There's now a shared statement agreed by all council leaders and chief execs that was adopted last December. And that shows what racism is, and crucially what anti-racism means in terms of leadership. It underpins our local action plan, and it has been developed under the last few months. We're leading that work for London Council, but we're also bringing it home and ensuring that our local anti-racism action plan will go to Cabinet this summer as part of a wider equality plan. It will then be subject to an extensive community consultation involving Scrutiny before coming back to Cabinet and Council for full adoption. That shows our commitment to wider accountability. All of our working is on the public website, anchored in Child Q's experience, but also that wider action on anti-racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the contributors that we've just had. To ensure that the Commission can cover all of the areas, I'm going to remind members of the Commission to ask single questions, please, and within the themes, and if responses can be brief and succinct so that we can get through as many questions as possible. So starting with a Q&A, we will start with the stop and search and more intimate searches of children. A, the authorisation, B, appropriate adult, C, the data and monitoring and efforts to address disproportionality. So for the first question, we've got Councillor Adejare. Oh, who did we? Oh, apologies.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Griffin and I'm a Deputy Member of Hackney Youth Parliament. And what I would like to ask is that whilst it is encouraging that no MTIP searches on under 18s have been undertaken since Child Q, it does raise questions as to what the justifications for them was previously, whether any will be undertaken again, and why, if an officer has grounds for an MTIP search, they couldn't just arrest and then bring the child to a station for questioning instead.
Before you answer that, James, I've just got a bit of a follow-up from Councillor Adejare, please.
Not so much a follow-up as an add-on. I think there is also a concern that some of the actions that we were taking locally could be perceived as performative. And there is a sense, as has already been heightened in some of the responses here today, that there's a call for longevity in terms of the approaches that were incorporated into practice locally. And if you appreciate it, if you could kind of talk on that as well, also in addition to what's already been put forward. Thank you.
Thanks both. Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll try and take them I'll take them slightly out of order actually. So the point around why search and not arrest. I mean, first and foremost, police custody is not a place where we should be finding children, and we should not be moving in any way to encouraging officers to make arrests of children and therefore place them in police detention and custody. So that's the thing we want to avoid at all costs. That's the thing I think most directly speaks to a child-centric approach. It is the avoidance of that which primarily sort of drive our need to keep a space in between normal engagement with the public and arrest. And in many cases, across the whole areas of policing, then search essentially acts as that barrier between normal engagement with the community and arrest and detention. There's also some sort of technical legal reasons why the thresholds for arrest and certainly the necessity that we have to be able to prove the need and the requirement for arrest might not be met, and yet the grounds for a search, not necessarily one in which more intimate parts are exposed, but even just a normal stop and search, those might be reached at a much lower threshold than quite rightfully the higher threshold for arrest. So that's one of the reasons why search is a preferred option than going directly to arrest. The question is really interested about what does this say about previous searches if we haven't had any since. Now, of course, a lot of policing powers rely on a high degree of subjectivity and the officer making a decision at that moment in that time. That's informed by training, input and guidance they receive from us as an organisation. And that was the point I guess I was very briefly getting at earlier, where I said there's a distinction between whether something's the right thing to do and whether it's technically allowed and authorised under law and under practice. And so whilst the thresholds for certainly and therefore might be lawful and therefore might be justifiable in legal sense, I think what we're seeing is an evaluation by policing which says, but actually was that the right thing to do? And a recognition that the proportionality of the use of that power wasn't correct historically, and therefore we're placing a much higher threshold, much more rigorous authorisation process on the use of searches where intimate parts are exposed, and therefore you see that volume really rapidly dropping off, and that's why we've had no, well, we call them M-tip searches, it's police slang for those searches where more intimate parts are exposed. Why we've seen that collapse from, and no searches of that nature happening since Child Q. Now, it's depressing for me as a senior police officer that it's taken, as we've said, Child Q and the voice of the child to shock us into that response, but nevertheless, I think what we're seeing is the appropriate response now and the appropriate recognition of severity of that level of search. In terms of how we, I guess, I think if I understood the question correctly, it was how do we ensure essentially that the longevity of that approach lasts and we don't sort of slip back to old ways in that sort of sense. And I think that's been the important work we've been doing with MOPAC, the important work we've been doing internally, looking at not just embedding these as tone and as posture, but actually embedding them in the authority levels up to inspector, critically creating that pause point where an officer can't go into a situation where they're often having to make decisions very quickly in matters of seconds or minutes, and we don't automatically as soon as then moving into an inappropriate search. You've got that pause point, reference back to an inspector. Inspector has a plan that had to work through to really test and verify, is it absolutely, not just is it lawful to do this, but is it necessary and proportionate to do this? And then added to that, the scrutiny of recording this in a way which forces the officers to record who they are, who the child is, who the appropriate adult is, where the searches are occurring, ensures that there is a safeguarding referral automatically as a consequence of that search, and refers that into putting that child-centric approach and that safeguarding approach at the heart. So we agree with Dame Rachel D'Souza. These should be the absolute exception, but there are a small number of cases where it may be necessary to conduct a search of this nature. We want them to be the exception, but we want them to be really carefully scrutinised, even internally, before conducting the search, as well as obviously that intense scrutiny that we would face afterwards and after the search has been conducted to ensure that it was lawful and proportionate. So hopefully that does give you the reassurance. This is not just a sort of a statement of tone locally, but this has been baked into practice procedure, even into the very computer systems that we use in policing to ensure that this is baked in.
Thank you, James. I think just as a point to note, I think it's the stark thing for us perhaps is the pendulum has swung entirely. which really does undermine the basis for the use of this tactic before then, because given that we've had a whole year and there haven't even been those exceptional circumstances that we're talking about, and that's often what we are hearing, not so much in my commission, but in the Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commission, that the reasons for heavy-handed policing that is experienced disproportionately by some members of the community is for those extreme purposes. And here we are sitting here with a year where we can't actually point to any examples of that potentially being the case.
But I think that's why the voice of the community and people, and in this case young people, but more broadly on some of those other areas, the voice of the community is so critical. It's very, very easy in large bureaucracies like policing and other institutions to normalise extreme activity there for extreme circumstances. But that's what scrutiny is there for. That's what the voice of the public sector is there for. And things like the Trust and Competence Working Group, the engagement, continue to be really critical on this journey to ensure that we're producing a brand of policing, which, yes, we have an enormous set of pretty incredible powers to utilise, but we're using them in a really sensible, really proportionate and a supported way. There is no policing power that is worth losing community support in order to attain and in order to use. So that community support has to come first, and then we find an effective way of using policing power, use our own operationally independent decision making to use those policing powers in a way which deals with problems, but also does so in a way that retains public support.
Thank you very much, James. We're running out of time for our questions, so can I ask for brevity with your subsequent responses, please? We've got a question from Councillor Root, please.
Thank you. My question is about improvements to data collection and data sharing around stop and search, and in particular around disproportionality on the use of force, on handcuffing in particular, and on repeated searches. What I'd like to know is how that data now is being used to ensure that there is progress addressing disproportionality. And if I can ask you a bit more specifically, from MOPAC's point of view, we heard about a dashboard, didn't we, where you're publishing data now. Are you, for instance, now going to publish data about the use of handcuffs and stop and search? That kind of data, is it going to be that organic? And from the police point of view, are you looking at that data to address it both with individual officers, but also with groups of officers as well when you're tackling this problem?
Yeah, I'll kick that off, and I'll note to the chair's comments, I'll try and be brief on this. Although these are big questions. So at a local level, one specific area we're looking at is some dedicated analysis around disproportionality. So one of the challenges we've got is there's a richness of data, but we don't yet have an understanding about what is driving the disproportionality. Is it the officers conducting the searches? Is it the locations the searches are happening? Is it the nature of the calls we're receiving from the public, which is driving some of the searches? So there is an underpinning piece of analysis which we're undertaking locally just within Hackney to understand what's driving disproportionality in Hackney. We're then looking at how do we represent that data and provide it in a way that's publicly consumable, and it helps the people of Hackney to hold us to account as scrutinisers on this. And that's where the Trust and Competence Working Group that the Council have been helping us set up have been really crucial. We had a meeting earlier this week where we're asking them that question: what data do you want? How do you want us to present this data? Because it's there available on dashboards, but to be honest, unless you're pretty adept around sort of statistical analysis, it can be a bit of a challenge to sort of scrutinise that data in an effective way. So what we want to, and it's not a case of sort of dumbing down the data, but it's presenting that data in a way which allows the public, allows the communities to scrutinise us. That's not there at the moment. We don't want to define how we produce that data. We want the community to tell us how they would like that data produced, and that's what we're committed to working with the Trust and Competence Working Group to develop. I suppose at a slightly more macro level, when we're looking at data, I know you mentioned handcuffing, repeated searches. There are mechanisms in place with more broadly in a Met for us to take the data on repeated searches if on Central East, Hackney Tower Hamlets, if we identify individuals who've been searched 3 or more times, we make an automatic referral into youth engagement teams. That means we look more carefully at the disproportionality or vulnerability of that individual, engaging with parents, schools, safeguarding. It might be the integrated gangs unit if it's related to gang activity. So there's a trigger mechanism around repeated searches to prompt a different response to better explore that individual case and instance. The handcuffing piece is interesting. I've commissioned another piece of research locally to look at handcuffing because the data doesn't come to us in a way which immediately presents itself around handcuffing. So we're having to do some additional analysis just to look at why handcuffing's happening. Has it increased locally? And certainly my position is any use of force in a search. I mean, use of search should be absolutely necessary. Use of force should be, as the legislation says, should be absolutely necessary in that interaction. It should not be the norm that people are being handcuffed in stop and search.
Thank you for that, James. I would like to get through the last couple of questions that we're hoping to ask in relation to this.
I was just going to respond to the question, Mo, but I'll be very, very brief to say we want to have as much data related to use of force, whether that is handcuffing, whether it's tasering, whether it's whatever, made public. If you look at the data for and the reforms around MTIPs within the Met, and you see the reduction in number, actually having that sort of transparency and having that sort of openness around the data has to be a good thing. And that's one of the things which Casey talked about, that culture of openness and transparency. So, but as James says, there is a bit of a quirk with the way it works, which needs to be resolved.
Thank you very much. I've got one final question from Councillor Ross, please. And just a reminder to our statutory partners here, we can have fuller written responses if you're really keen to get across the sort of fuller answers that you're sharing this evening. So if we can keep responses brief, please. Councillor Ross.
Thanks, Chair. You did touch on the issue I wanted to explore briefly in your presentation, which is where more intimate searches are taking place, what assurances can you provide that additional safeguards will be provided? But I know you did just a few moments ago talk about data as well, but I also would like to know what assurances you can provide on the fact that data in relation to this will be recorded and published, and also if you could let us know when we can start seeing that data come through. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the data is available on Stop and Search via the Met Police website. As I say, one of the challenges is not exactly user-friendly and accessing or making sense of it. So what we want to produce is a local Hackney version of that data, which is much more readily accessible, and more importantly, has been designed by the community, as in they inform us on how they want the data presented. The data on MTIP searches forms part of that. So MTIP searches, the searches where more intimate parts are exposed, forms part of that. As we say, we haven't had one of those searches since Child Q here on Hackney. In terms of the ensuring that safeguarding approach, I think this was the other bit of your question, ensuring a safeguarding approach follows. Again, that's been baked in some of the process that we've now wrapped around the searches, and particularly a pilot, which we have set up here on Hackney for a multi-agency trauma-informed response to any MTIP searches. Of course, the irony here being that because we haven't conducted any of the searches, we haven't been able to put the pilot into effect. Now, that's a good thing, clearly, but we have a pilot ready to go with multi-agency response, including children's social services, ready to go if we did have a subsequent use of the MTIP power.
Thank you very much. And now we'll be moving on to our next theme, which is safeguarding first approach for local children. First question, I'm going to go to Martha, please.
What progress has been made within the BCU and wider Metropolitan Police in ensuring that safeguarding first approach is adopted for the searching of children, especially in relation to drugs?
So I didn't hear the full question. Is that just related to searching of children in relation to drugs? Yeah. So again, we've been really keen to put safeguarding at the heart of our approach, and by no means have we arrived at the end point. And I think Dame Rachel D'Souza would very quickly, I think, point out that we're certainly not there at the end point of a journey, but I think we're certainly there at the start and have moved past the starting line on that journey. So one of our principles is to really try and enforce this approach of not criminalising young people through the use of drug searches. And it's not necessarily just the search itself, it's what follows afterwards. So the danger in the past was a search where small amounts of drugs were found, and then the child automatically entered the criminal justice system, was arrested, went to court, and then we have a criminalisation process occurring. And what we've seen locally here, particularly in our work with ADA and Continuum, these are drugs projects that we're running on, counter drugs projects we're running on Hackney, is combining both a health approach to those who are using drugs, a really hard-end policing response to the organised crime networks which are driving the drugs market, but then a diversionary approach to any young people that are caught up and are found with drugs in their possession. So, for example, at the moment, a very small fraction of those children who are found in possession of drugs end up being charged and cautioned, only around 4% now, which is significantly lower than we would have seen 10 years ago. And that's part of a package of local measures that we work with partners through our youth offending services, but also the officers have additional ways of dealing with these matters on the street where we can divert children to other alternatives rather than sending them through the criminal justice system. So that's our initial response, is to divert away from the criminal justice system, but the other approach is to identify whether there's a wider safeguarding need. So if a young person's got a larger quantity of drugs, are they being exploited by criminal gangs? Are they vulnerable themselves? And can we make an intervention to safeguard and place that child into a safer setting, work with other partners in social services and elsewhere to essentially rescue the child out of the dangerous situation they found themselves, and recognising they're not there as a suspected drug dealer, they are there as a vulnerable child who needs safeguarding and protecting in that environment. And again, as a consequence of that, we see a very, very small number of prosecutions for drug traffic offences, so drug supply and other related offences. Again, I think we've only had 6 instances of that in the last year in Hackney. So a far higher number of people found with drugs on their possession, but a recognition that the vast majority of those have been quite rightfully safeguarded and taken into a supportive environment rather than being criminalised. What we do want to do is criminalise the criminals, so those who are further up the tree and those who are driving the drugs markets are well and truly criminalised by our activity, but not the children.
Thank you very much for that, James. And I slightly disagree with you on the point about when you're dealing with children and drugs, that you have to look into whether there is a safeguarding need. I would argue that any child found with a substantial amount of drugs, there is a safeguarding need. Children do not bring drugs into this country. There is some form of exploitation involved.
Yeah, so I think I was referring to it, including lower levels of possession, but I absolutely take your point, yes, yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think we're going to move on to the next theme now, which is building trust and confidence in local policing. For the first question, Sudanese, please.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Susan Astop. I'm the young mayor of Hackney. I'm also the Hackney Youth Parliament member leading on education, crime and policing. My question is directed to the Borough Commander. As the Borough Commander has now been in post for the past few months, and in light of the Casey review, where I'm sure many of you read that the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic, how will he prioritise implementing meaningful change in local practice, and what impact will this have on Hackney residents, especially young residents, as we are unfortunately often the ones who experience Metropolitan Police power exploitation and are the ones who are left voiceless? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that's a big question, and I probably, I mean, if we do need to follow this up with further detail, we can do so. So, I mean, in very high-level summary, I think there's 3 main parts to this. One is what we do, one is what tools and procedures we use, and the other is how we use those. So, what we do, we continue to prioritise key areas like violence against women and girls. We continue to prioritise high harm offences, but we also balance that with high impact offences. So one of the challenges I think policing over the last couple of years is become obsessed with a small category of offences, which are rightfully and will perennially be important areas for policing. But for many residents, it means but there's a sense that our focus has drifted away from the things which matter to them. So one of our challenges here locally, and this is not an instantaneous fix, this is several years of endeavour to switch our model around to this approach, is to start balancing out both focus on high harm offences, but also focusing at very localised neighbourhoods levels on the type of crimes that are affecting people, and particularly types of crimes which are affecting young people in the areas. The classic here being that there is rightfully a focus on violence, but of course violence isn't impacting on all people equally across the borough of Hackney. There's lots of other offending types, lots of other risks, lots of other dangers which are impacting on people, and we need to be better at balancing between those two areas, not become unduly focused on single or small categories of issues. And this is consistent with a lot of what the Commissioner's talking about in what he calls his turnaround plan. There's also then the tools and the techniques we use, and when we talk about stop and search, when we talk about the internet searches that we've been talking about here, this very much falls into that category. How are we using them? How do we address that disproportionality that we're seeing, and the work that we're undertaking, the analysis, and then the action which we'll be taking to try and right that disproportionality.
Sorry, James, can I ask you to wind up, please?
Okay.
Sorry.
I mean, there's a big question. We do need to have a little bit of a chance to provide a response. So this is looking at the powers and procedures that we're using and addressing that disproportionality. The third is then how we're doing it. And that, as we mentioned earlier, is the behaviour and culture of my officers when they're carrying out those activities. At the very least, I want behaviours which are confident, but are also human and courteous. And I want people treated with respect across the borough of Hackney. And there's a range of behaviours, a range of changes that we can make in the training and the expectations we place on our officers, which can drive a much more human, much more respectful model of policing here on Hackney.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Councillor Ogundemurin, please. And I think we're going to have to ensure that responses are kept to about 2 minutes, please, so that at tops, again, we're able to have fuller written responses. Thank you.
Yep, so I'm Councillor Joseph Ogundemurin, living in Hackney, Scrutiny Commission member. My question is for, I guess, the Council, the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. So how does the partnership feel the Central East Borough Commander Unit leadership is showing commitment and leadership in anti-racist practice, safeguarding, community engagement, collaboration, community monitoring, scrutiny, and police/partnership training?
Yeah, please.
Thanks
Mayor.
for the question. My perspective as Mayor leading the Council in partnership with the Chief Executive, and I think from what we've heard this evening, is the BCU and its leadership have moved substantially than when we were last in this room, not just in their responses this evening and how they're approaching these issues, but also the work that's taken place between the two meetings and what has been set out this evening. Now, I fully reflect on the point around, you cannot have a new broom culture and response to these systemic and long-lasting issues. But when I think about the partnership that has been built locally around the action plan, around the action board that we're a part of, all of the work that was outlined by Councillor Jana Thomas earlier, that things have substantially moved on than when we were last here. I think it is also at the heart of the technical responses that the Borough Commander has given, as well as the value-driven overlay that he has placed about the type of policing that he wants to see here. My caveats to this, though, are whatever we do locally in our partnership work with the police and that critical challenge that I think all of us have outlined previously, the Met and the police more broadly are a hierarchical organisation, and that the failure of the Commissioner to accept the Casey review in terms of institutional racism is a fundamental barrier to moving this on. And it is that defensiveness that I think still remains a challenge, and we articulated in the joint statement that Councillor Jana Thomas and I made to the Casey review. And why I think the failure to adopt that institutional racism definition is important is it actually moves away from the idea of not just the bad apple idea within the police, but the idea that every individual officer must accept some degree of responsibility, because it is the institution that leads to racist outcomes, not that bad apple idea or individual officers. So I think adopting it institutionally would make this discussion a lot easier. We are now waiting, though, for what will be turnaround plus from the Commissioner. And I think the whole system response will be judged in that context. But I have absolute confidence in the work that is happening locally between the council and the police in moving these issues forward and taking them seriously.
Thank you very much. I think we'll just have that answer, please, for that question. We'll move on to a question from Councillor Charlton.
Thank you, Chair. My question's for Commander Conway. What progress has been made in building a diverse team of police officers at all levels of seniority in the local BCU? And what reassurance could you give, say, a young Black woman wanting to join the service, you know, in terms of the inevitable potential backlash from sections of her own community?
So one of the areas which I don't have control over is in the recruitment of police and postings of senior officers into the BCU. So that's centrally managed by the Met. We regularly make strong representation that we really have to have the most diverse leadership team that we can obtain from the Met, but we are subject to wider Met posting processes, and many of my other BCU commanders, of course, are all making the same demands. We have an improving and more visible diversity in leadership at both, particularly at superintendent and chief inspector level. But I mean, as I epitomised, we're still heavily dominated by white men. So we still have some way to go. In terms of the wider workforce, Central East, Hackney and Tower Hamlets does benefit from one of the most diverse policing London. Again, that's not to rest on laurels. We're a long way short of our objectives and a long way short of reflecting the communities that we specifically serve. But we are in some ways better than other areas of London, though that's not to take any solace from that fact. There's still a long way to go. If I understood the question correctly, it was more around a backlash of community. That's somewhat difficult to answer from an internal and professional perspective. What we can give is an absolute commitment about the environment we're seeking to create in the BCU for officers who come and join us and work with us. There is an absolute expectation of zero tolerance for racist, misogynist, sexist behaviour. We have racist, sexist and misogynist in the police. They have been outed in the media and you've seen them in court facing the full strength of the law. It would be absurd for me to suggest that they are removed and we don't have others in our midst like that. But the concerted effort of all in this organisation is to root out those criminals that shouldn't be in our ranks. And let's be honest, if you're racist, you're probably also sexist, and you're probably also a misogynist, you're potentially also homophobic as well. We want you out, and the environment then that we're creating through that zero tolerance is one which drives
Thank you, James. Sorry, we're running out of time. Sorry that I keep catching you, and most of the questions have gone to you, so apologies for that. It probably would have done the same with the others. But I've got a question from Councillor Suso Runga, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is specifically about training. What progress has been made in delivering a compulsory and relevant training programme for new police recruits, those in training and existing police officers? And importantly, what input have local communities had in designing and delivering training? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Good question. And this is a large part of our effort now going forwards as part of the joint plan with local authority. So at very basic recruit training, on about day 9 of arrival at a basic recruit training, officers have input specifically on use of force, stop and search, and adultification training, and other aspects are included in that. There's also some specific scenario testing now baked into recruit training to specifically address the adultification question, particularly on those officers who are coming into a non-degree route and their training construct. When those officers then arrive here at Central East, and part of our idea about building a Hackney and Tower Hamlets model of policing is, of course, to try and grab people as they arrive and condition them into the type of policing activity we want. We have a period of 10 weeks of focused education when they arrive here. The first day of that 10 weeks, they get input on the lessons from Child Q, on stop and search, on cultural awareness input, and we have community volunteers who come and acclimatise those new officers on what the diverse communities of Hackney are, and some of the particular needs and requirements of those communities. So that's baked into the training they receive here. We have been working with the council looking at adultification training. We've trained around 100 officers, focusing particularly on our schools officers and neighbourhoods officers first and foremost on that. We've also been looking at trauma-informed training for those who work in gangs, youth offending and drugs activity to adopt that trauma-informed approach we talked about and the diversionary tactics. And really from now on, we're also working with the Met Central Training team on a continuous professional development offer that would be offered to all of our staff. And we're working with local authority partners to see how do we merge that aspect with community input, with specific input on racism, and then we're looking at some more advanced ideas on how we can educate an awareness of officers' own behaviours and own stresses in the decision making and undertaking. Because one of the lessons that's drawn out a number of these reports and the research available is that stressful situations for the officer are potentially driving disproportionate outcomes, and there's some good research which suggests that an intervention approach in that could improve the outcomes from policing. So we're now looking at combining those 3 or 4 different elements into a localised training package.
Thank you. I think Councillor Fajana Thomas wanted to also come in.
Yeah, it is quickly, Chair, just to add to what James have said in terms of working with the council. We've been working with the police, in particular, working with the Trust and Confidence community group in discussion around training. One of the priorities for the 5 areas of the action plan is around training. We have supported the council through Sonia's team. They putting a training together that will incorporate anti-racism identification as well as trauma and bias together in one training that we hope not just for newly recruited officers, but all officers in the BCU will have the opportunity to do that training. Well, I know time is pressed. Sonia, do you want to add anything?
I don't think we'll allow any other contributions, I'm afraid. Sorry. We've got a question from Councillor Binny Lubbock, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to know what progress has been made in developing and enhancing local community monitoring, consultation and engagement, and how the partners have worked to increase joint police and community participation and representation. I know Councillor Fajana Thomas mentioned about the community conversations that have already begun. I'd like to know what the kind of outcomes and impacts of those have been thus far.
Yes, please.
Well, it's kind of a joint issue, so sort of whoever feels best placed to speak to it.
Share it with Kenny from MOPAC, please.
I'll start. So we obviously, as part of the Mayor's action plan, there was something in there about overhauling community scrutiny in particular to make sure that it was able to better represent local communities. We've had very good engagement so far with James as the Borough Commander with that, with lead councillors and with officers from the council here. We are very close to being able to get that off the ground. There are some final little hoops, as ever with these things, which need to be sort of jumped through at various ends. But I would say that we have made very good progress. It has been very collaborative and a very collegiate approach thus far. I'm glad others are nodding. And we hope that this will be able to launch in the near future.
Thank you. I think we'll just leave that answer for that question, please. I think we're going to move on to a question from Councillor, I think we're now going to move on to policing in schools, please. The first question will be from Sarah, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bishop and I'm a member of Hackney Youth Parliament. My question is, the review of the Safer School officers in London found that there was a disproportionate impact on Black and global majority students in the schools which police officers were present, and the MPs agreed to review this service. Has there been any outcomes of this review?
Yes, so I suppose at two layers, and Mopac may want to comment as well. So at a Met level, there's current work chaired by Commander Helen Harper, who set up the Safer Schools Partnership Board, that's specifically looking at the strategic direction of the Safer Schools model and looking at some of those direct specific recommendations that were made there. Particularly, it's informed by non-police partners, which I think is critical. So Mopac, but also Ofsted heads academy sort of leads and so forth. Then there's also sort of the local area layer here in Hackney. So what we have is the ability within the Safer Schools protocol, which is a sort of guidance on how safer schools officers operate, to affect a local addendum. So we've been working closely with local authority partners, education partners, to develop a new addendum that would again define some specific nuances and rules around how we do safer schools work here in Hackney. We've been consulting closely with children in the schools in 2020, and we then moved on over the last couple of weeks consulting with parents last week, and we've got another event tomorrow to look again at that. And we're looking at things like making heads aware when we're on premises, ensuring we don't make any arrests on school, greater involvement with the S7 students at the start of their high school journey, and looking at some of the governance and arrangements with parents to ensure that they're better sighted on what we're doing in the schools. So two layers really, some of this happening at a Met-wide level and some of this happening specifically locally here in Hackney.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to move on to a question from Mia with a follow-up from Councillor Garbutt, please.
Hello, my name is Mia Arthur, and I'm the elected representative of the British Youth Council for Hackney Youth Parliament. My question is, how are schools and safeguarding partners working together to make schools safe for children without the need for a police presence?
Councillor Garbutt, did you have any additional comments to that?
Yeah, my comment was just to add to this and then pick up on something that Jim said earlier about whether you stick to the comments that you're making about the police being present in schools, given how we know children and young people currently feel about police presence. Thank you.
First of all, it shouldn't be for the police to make children safe in schools. That is for the school community, teachers, parents, and young people themselves. The problem with policing in schools and the issue with partnership is I am supportive of James, I am optimistic, but I disagree with some of what he said in here today. I think the Safer Schools programme is yet not fit for purpose. It is too dependent upon the personality of the individual officer. It's not built on a programme of work that integrates and engages. So when 2 or 3 new officers come in, to Hackney, they should be going to MCA, they should be going to Clapham Girls' Schools, they should be facilitated by the Safer Schools officer to engage and put a real face. Where we have found Safer Schools officers working, and I have been speaking in schools now for the past couple of months to young people in the absence of teachers, where we found it's working, doesn't matter whether the police officer is black or white. It depends on whether or not the police officer engages as a human being with respect for the young people they're engaging with. So I've heard young people say, oh, well, she's not like a Safer Schools officer. She really loves her kids. She's doing this, she's doing that. I've heard other comments, which actually I wouldn't want to repeat here, about the negative impact of the wrong Safer Schools officer in the wrong place. So we are working, we are going to, as part of the recommendations we make, there's not an issue here that's been touched on tonight that doesn't feature. If the law allows a child to be searched, then that law is wrong. And that law cannot be bound by policy at the whim of police. The law needs to be adapted and it needs to be changed. If we haven't had MTIP searches, actually, you know what, there's no justification for them. And I cannot see why it's not better to be arrested if you represent that level of risk and brought into an environment where you're supervised and where you can have access to an appropriate adult and your parent than to be searched in a premises like a school that you go to every day and revisit the trauma. This is the problem. We revisit trauma on young people when we search them in the spaces and places that they routinely frequent where there's not sufficient justification. And the Children's Commissioner report highlights that. Kids in schools are telling me these things are done primarily searching for drugs. Yet what happens in 52% of the cases, nothing is found. So there needs to be a radical rethink. We need to be honest about this. Hackney policing needs to go back to ground zero. It's not like policing in Newcastle. It's not like policing in other places and spaces. There are common themes, but an adversarial position has developed here. Not a single young person that I've spoken to in any school when I ask, do you want to join the police? Would you be willing to join the police? Put their hand up. That's a problem because these intelligent, articulate young people from their community, of their community, want the best for it. So we're going to introduce a range of work that allows us to survey children in all of our schools to look at safety and respect. How safe do they feel and how respected do they feel in school and travelling to and from school? So there's a range of methods that will all be in the next report.
I'm very sorry, but we're going to have to move on. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to move on to, there's another question which other officers might want to come in on and address any of those points from that previous question, but there's a question from Sudanese, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is towards Hackney Education, Metropolitan Police and Mayor's Office of Police and Crime. Has there been any consultation or engagement with local school children and young people in relation to the role of the Safer Schools officers, its acceptability in schools, or to assess if any changes might be needed? Thank you.
As Deputy Mayor Bramble, I think indicated that she wanted to come in on the previous question. Would you like to come in on this one?
So wanted to say that all of the schools had submitted the safeguarding assessment that they are required to do, and it's set out in Jim's report. So there has been some work that has been done around this, and it's involved young people, consultation with parents, as mentioned before, and really hearing the view of young people of how they view this role. And as Jim had said, young people are not necessarily saying remove the officer. What young people are saying, we want to trust that adult that's there to help us when we're worried or concerned. And at the moment, sometimes they don't see that person in that role. So we're doing some work alongside the police around this. We're due to meet with them and scope out a piece of work and think about how we can work more closely together, because ultimately you want young people to be able to trust the police and see them as someone that they can trust when they are in trouble. But those negative experiences, and as Jim said, the trauma that some young people have experienced, that is a real barrier, and actually that then puts children more at risk, not in making them feel safer.
Sorry, Kenny.
Sorry, I was just going to respond
very brief, please.
Very briefly, I promise, to the question of whether we'd done any speaking to children and young people about Safer Schools officers. The answer to which is kind of no and yes. So not specifically within a Hackney setting. We have done a London-wide survey of about 12,000 young Londoners, which asks them, amongst other things, about their views of Safer Schools officers, whether they support them, whether they don't, how that makes them feel, their engagement, all of those things. Now, we've got the data back at the moment and we're just analysing that. I would hope that we're in a position to publish that. I don't want to put too much of a deadline on it, but maybe within the next month or so. I would hope, and that will, and I'll make sure that we send a copy across once we've got the findings, but that should certainly answer some of those initial questions. I'm afraid I don't have the exact details of what it says at the moment, but once we have them, we'll provide it.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to move on to the audit of school safeguarding policies. I have questions from Andy, please.
Thank you, Chair. This question is to Hackney Education and also CHSCP. So Hackney Education reported in June that it was facilitating a local audit of school safeguarding policies in response to the Child Q Safeguarding Practice Review. Can Hackney Education provide the Commission with an update on the results of this audit and the changes made across local schools? And the second question, to what extent have school leaders positively engaged with Hackney Education, City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership, and other partners regarding the evaluation of the safeguarding policies and procedures in schools?
Who feels most comfortable answering that question? Paul, please.
Thank you. Local authority working with the Safeguarding Children's Partnership uses its Section 175 safeguarding audit powers on an annual basis to maintain oversight on how local schools are delivering their safeguarding policy and practice. The outcomes from that audit process will go into the local area Safeguarding Children's Partnership as well. And that, on the back of that, allows them to targeted training and development activity or targeted interventions where there may be a need as well. At a local level, the head teacher of each school would have to sign off the audit process as well as it's undertaken. But all of Hackney schools have engaged with the annual safeguarding audit process. It's a Section 11 that allows us to maintain oversight of the whole system right across the local area. So in response, very much our head teachers are cited because they would sign off the audit process, but it allows us to identify strengths, weaknesses, and what's working and what's not working, and allow for targeted follow-up activity.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. I'm now moving on to a question from Sarah, please.
What advice has been provided by Hackney Education to local schools, to local school leaders about their school behaviour policies in relation to, 1, their compliance with equality duties, 2, the need to make reasonable adjustments for pupils, and 3, the disproportionate impact that they may have on different cohorts of children? Thank you.
In order for us to try and save some time, I'm going to also take the question from Councillor Turbot-Deloff, which is somewhat linked to this, so that we can have one answer that deals with the two, please.
Thank you, Chair. Aside from behaviour policies, what assurance can Hackney Education provide that other tangible improvements have been made across local schools to improve safety and safeguarding of children since the Child Q Safeguarding Practice Review? Thank you.
Do you want to come in, Paul?
Thank you. Many colleagues will be well aware of the work of the Inclusion Charter that Hackney Education is progressing with the work of local school leaders, system leaders and partners across crime reduction, education, social care and health, which has a focus on equality, diversity and inclusion to develop a shared language, a shared understanding of how local area partners will work together and develop a core baseline. So we're at an advanced stage of progressing the work of the Charter and should be in a position actually to bring it forwards to children's scrutiny in the not too distant future for further dialogue, challenge around that as well. So colleagues would be well cited. Many colleagues in here actually would have played a role in shaping and designing the work of the Inclusion Charter, specifically that generates that consistency of approach, practice and shared language across the local area.
To add, in terms of behaviour policy, there has been some work done with schools. We also worked with parents and young people that have been impacted by some of those policies within schools that you spoke about. So whether it's especially around here, there's been lots of talk about Afro here in schools, the stars in schools, and we've worked with children, young people and parents and schools, and we've now updated those policies that are with schools.
Can I just add one very quick thing? There's some good practice being identified in some schools which have formed Black and Global Majority parental committees to help them look at the aftermath of this, and they've been invited to look at the policies with regards to uniform, dress and hair. And whilst that may sound trivial, it's really important and has had a significant impact. So there is some good practice emerging, and that too will be reflected in the update.
Thank you. I think the Mayor also wants to come in.
No, I was going to first share to sort of bridge into what Jim's just said. I know that some of the reasons for the delay is the extensive engagement that Jim has done with school leadership teams about probing this issue and the recommendation and moving it forward. It's something that I really support in the conversations that I've had with him, and I think that to show that visible progress in the update is really, really important. It is also at the heart of every conversation that Deputy Mayor Bramble and I have with school leadership teams and the academy trusts that operate in the borough around recognising the communities that they serve and the impact that the disproportional application of and design of behaviour policies have on children and families, and moving that alongside the leadership of Hackney Education. I think backed up with where we're heading with the update review, will show really meaningful progress on that and show that we're listening to the communities we all serve and ultimately represent.
I think we're going to have to move on. We've got another 2 questions, I think, and then we're going to have to bring this item to a close. Got a question from Councillor Ross, please.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is, how well have partners engaged in the development and delivery of the Anti-Racist Action Plan? And is there a shared commitment across the partnership to develop and progress its objectives?
Sonia.
Sorry, I'm going to bridge into Sonia, but let's for time go straight to Sonia.
So in terms of the 2 partners that we're particularly looking at today, the police and schools, the focus since the child queue review, but obviously as you've all said, this issue has been known about before and the conversations have started before, but the focus since then has been building an even deeper understanding of, first of all, what racism means, and then what anti-racism means, really building on the Macpherson definition and making sure that that is understood. So it's not about bad apples. It's not about a policy that's written once and then put away. The work with schools, I'm not going to go into because I think it has been well reported on before and published, but I have colleagues here who could talk about that. In terms of work with police, which hasn't been as well documented because it has been very much about formative work that's needed to make sure that, first of all, there's that deep understanding of what racism means. And we've really started with working with colleagues in the police to do deep listening with residents, with us as well, so that they've got that, they're drawing their understanding from the lived experience of residents, and I hope you've heard that today. And then moving on to locate that in both the Trust and Confidence in Police Action Plan, so there's a strand on anti-racism, but also then reciprocate that in the Anti-Racism Action Plan, which the Mayor has referenced, so having that conversation about a shared definition there. So in terms of the work with the police, I think the key thing is that it's about going beyond what we might do in training or we might say in policy that appeals to logic or just good values. And it is about going beyond that and really trying to probe what's happening in the operational moment and what intervention is needed. And that's where we are now in terms of locating how anti-racism can work in practice. And I would say that's the same with children's practice and in schools. So moving beyond that, I just wanted to assure you that there has also been a lot of parallel work going on with partners across the system, which I can't go into in detail, but I can provide written follow-up in writing. But we are now moving to that formal commitment, and that's the starting point for the Mayor of going to Cabinet with a fully worked through anti-racism action plan. Before we do that, we will be formally going to partners to seek their commitment to the objectives and the understanding that's there, and that builds on that London-wide commitment which Hackney led the defining of.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and very, very briefly, Deputy Mayor Bramble.
Thank you, Chair. Provide in writing the work that Children's Social Care has led on with Hackney Education around the anti-racist practice, all the internal work that staff have been doing, including Children's Social Care, Diane and Deborah speaking at the annual Ofsted conference talking about the anti-racist practice that's here in Hackney, but provide more detail in writing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And now we're moving on to our final question from Councillor Adajari, and I think we've got some follow-up comments from Councillor Palace.
Let's thank everybody for their contributions today. My question relates to accountability. According to the Casey report, Metropolitan Police Service lacks accountability and transparency in respect of Londoners, but also on a local level. There's a feeling that the senior leadership is responsible, but not accountable, and too far removed from policing on the ground. While we see the steps that are being taken in Hackney locally, as I said before, we need longevity in terms of these actions. So while you are not accountable to us, you work in partnership with us, there's a call for this kind of work to happen on a higher level, which we don't have the powers to ensure that happens. So how do we work around this and ensure that what we do is firmly embedded, that our local service is accountable to us, and the calls for change that we kind of request, without having to demand, I hope, are kind of taken on board and accepted as fact. As I said, it's taken us a long time here to get to this point where we are now, it being the trauma of Child Q, which ultimately brought us here. So before we, in the hope we never get to a stage like that again, in terms of accountability, the voices that we have, we've got trust and confidence, but ultimately we don't know higher up how that group is going to be perceived by the Met Commissioner, given that he doesn't accept that institutional racism is an issue. So in terms of accountability, how does that work in terms of the hierarchical structures that's already been outlined? What can you do as our borough commander to make sure that our voices are listened to, the voices of our young people are listened to, and that our needs are met long term without hindrance? Thank you very much.
And just a further point from Councillor Palace, please.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you everybody for your contributions. With faith in the Metropolitan Police being at an all-time low following the Casey review, is the Metropolitan Police too big to protect young people in this borough and across London? And is it not time that the Metropolitan Police is broken up into parts? Thank you.
Thanks for those two to finish on. So let me take those in turn. I mean, I suppose that, again, there's layers here to unpick. So I very definitely feel a strong sense of accountability and scrutiny locally, both before you all as councillors within the partnership, which is both friend but also very testing friend, through oversight and scrutiny such as Jim's work and Jim's report, but also critically the thing that's emerged most recently over the last series of months is the direct public engagement through the community conversations, the working groups and others which we talked about. So I think it's translating some of that into permanent structures. Some of that comes through the scrutiny pilot which we've talked about, which gives direct community voice and scrutiny over policing practice. Some of it is through the evolving nature of the partnership and the oversight we see there. Some of it requires a broader conversation at MOPAC and frankly, probably going beyond that international levels. There is, as you'll be well aware, sort of legal frameworks for scrutiny, which define the way in which the Commissioner is accountable to the PCC or the Mayor, particularly for delivery of policing and use of resources, and accountable to the law for the use of policing powers. So changes at that senior political level sadly, and this is the only time I'm slightly dodging this question on this basis, but slightly above my pay grade and would need to be debated at that force-wide and national level. But I think Casey opens the door for conversations on that point. On the question of whether the Met is too big, again, that's certainly a conversation much broader than mine, but is fundamentally a conversation where the public voice needs to sit at the heart of it. I know there will be debate and discussion on that at national layers going forwards. The one thing I would say that regardless of the construct which sits above us, and in some ways, so I think Louise Casey made some very profound observations in her report, but there's also a sense that regardless of what sits above me structurally, What's important is the entity which exists at this BCU level and the way that I can directly impact and make decisions on policing practice and policing delivery, which is very relevant to Hackney and Tower Hamlets. So in a sense, I'm not sure I would necessarily feel any different sitting in an East London police force or a different regionalised construct of police forces in London. The core is that I have partnerships here at a local level, accountability, well, scrutiny certainly at a local level, accountability through those partnerships as I've described, and ability to make decisions and make variations of police practice at a local level.
I mean, to answer the second question first, I think the answer would be, is the Met too big? No. But does the Met need to reform, improve, work better? Yes. London is a particularly complex environment with people moving between different boroughs, different areas, much more so than perhaps other areas of the country. So I think there is a thing, although the Met is massive and it really is very big, frontline policing alone has more officers than the next biggest force in the country, West Midlands. I do think that sort of coordination it can bring is a good thing. In terms of the overall accountability, and James has said a lot about that, I think the main thing I would say, which came out of Casey, we should talked about the officers who would say, oh, they have to go back on borough, or it was seen as a sort of punishment, or it's seen as a negative step and not with the kudos that perhaps some of those central functions have. I think that is a key bit of the culture of the Metropolitan Police as an institution and the officers within it, which really does need to change regardless of whether you break up the Met, you don't break up the Met. That is a really fundamental bit, and that goes to a lot of what we've been talking about tonight about how they engage with people humanely, whether they take a child-centric approach, and the overall approach to recruitment, making sure that you have more sort of local people who are policing local areas, whether it's PCSOs or others. So I would just sort of leave it there. And then MOPAC and the Mayor clearly has a role in holding the Commissioner firmly to account for making sure that he does deliver on that.
Thank you very much. I think Councillor Fajana Thomas wanted to come in for final words.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be very brief, just to say in terms of accountability and long-term work we are doing with the police, to add to what James said, unfortunately, as you know, Assistant Commissioner Kyle Gordon is not here tonight, but our trust and confidence work has got a buy-in from the Central Med, and as a council, the Mayor, we've been doing this. We're going to be pushing the Central Med to continue to buy into the trust and confidence. What we are doing is not an isolated work. Again, you might not be aware, in January, Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner, visited Hackney, that are organized for him to meet the trust and confidence community group. And one of the things people mentioned to him strongly, including myself, is the trust and confidence what we are doing in Hackney, and he assured us of his support for the work. So I have confidence that through those two channels, we're going to continue to push this work to be not just responding to child Q, is a wider trust and confidence work that will bring change in Hackney. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That's now the end of that item, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Councillor Adejare, who's going to provide a summary and details of next steps. Thank you.
Okay, once again, thank you to all attendees, particularly those who've travelled from further afield. I'm doing a combination of things. I think as councillors and representatives of Hackney, we recognise when institutions perpetuate processes or attitudes which bring about disproportionality or, in effect, institutional racism. We can call it that in this safe space, despite other people not recognising it as such. As evidenced by the work by Dame D'Souza and Baroness Casey, disproportionality is stark in respect of the experiences of our young people and the policing they receive, likewise, impact of some of the structures within our educational settings. Tonight we've heard from the Borough Commander, who's working collaboratively with partners to address processes and systems, which in their manifestation can only be described as institutionally racist. And this is despite, as Mayor Glanville highlighted, and I have as well, Your top boss, Met Commissioner, not recognising this fact. In response to safeguarding, you've also been able to implement a moratorium on MTIP searches, I think which we are grateful for as a borough, in the hope that that can be permanently embedded, given the trauma that's been outlined by Dame D'Souza and the impact it has on our young people long term. Likewise, there's been recognition of the fact of the work and good practice that's been undertaken in terms of universal safeguarding for all children and young people attending our schools. Ultimately, no child should experience a different approach in any of our educational settings simply because of the colour of their skin. Likewise, when they walk our streets and encounter our officers. What I hope everyone sitting here takes from the work that's been undertaken across our borough and by people such as yourself, Dame D'Souza, is an understanding of the fact that the outcry against the processes and attitudes many of our Black children and young people are subject to should not be cyclical or simply responding to media amplification. And we've had affirmation of the fact that that's not what we're doing here. But as scrutiny commissions, it's on us to ensure that nothing drops or slips in terms of what we've heard. The focus on accountability is therefore paramount in terms of what we do, particularly in terms of how we measure outcomes. All the policy making and immediate responses, our community needs to have an all-encompassing sense of agency over how they're policed and how their children are treated in our schools. Will there be meaningful lines of accountability that any of us can access and ensure that the response is what is needed in terms of the community? Change has to be substantive and tangible as we move to a place where our children are all on equal footing. Reflecting on the evidence and responses we've heard tonight, we will continue to monitor the efficacy of the work being undertaken across the board alongside its wider impact with a view to be making further recommendations. We'll also be looking at what you do, Dame D'Souza, very, very closely as you move your work forward in the hope that what you do does become embedded legislatively. It should be noted, as Councillor Conway pointed out at the beginning, there are two reports which still need to be considered by the Joint Commission, the IOPC and the Safeguarding Practice Review follow-up, receipt of which are likely to necessitate a further meeting of the Joint Commission. So we are making headway. We are making headway. You know, it took a traumatic situation to get us to where we are, but we can see that as an authority, the work that's been undertaken across the board is progressive. As I said, there can be no backsliding at all. So once again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to Commission members for their awesome questions. And more importantly, to our Parliament, our youth Parliament members who were fantastic in terms of what they put forward to our attendees as well. I'll leave Councillor Conway to do the closing. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody for this evening's meeting, everybody who's made contributions. And just to echo what my colleague has just said, that all of these issues will remain very firmly rooted in the work that we do on our respective commissions, and no doubt the work that our partners who have joined us here today are intending to do. We're here today because of Child Q, but the themes that run through, or the themes that emerge from Child Q's case, extend beyond what we've covered today necessarily, and it permeates every aspect of what we do as a council, and it's incumbent upon us as scrutineers to ensure that that is front and centre of our minds in every piece of work that we embark on. Institutional racism, systemic injustice is insidious, and it requires, therefore, an attentiveness that we all have to commit to. I'm now going to close this meeting. Thank you, everybody, for attending.